How's everybody doing this morning? Okay, a few of you are good. That's all right. That's good. It's so good to be back here. I realized this morning that it's been just about exactly a year since the last time I got a chance to stand up here and share some encouragement with you all. As Shayna said in the introduction video, my name is Rob. I used to be on staff here, for those of you who don't know me. I am currently the Associate Executive Director for the YMCA in Rochester, New Hampshire. Come to find out, people in New Hampshire need Jesus just as much as Maine people. And so I've been working for the Y for the last year, doing some different things. It's been certainly an exciting and interesting and challenging year, as it has been here. But I'm glad to be back. I realized that this morning that it is kind of like riding a bike. You can just dust off some of the rust and get right back up on it. And so this morning I want to share some things with you that I think have been an encouragement to me as I've been going through this book. As if you're just joining us for the first time, we've been in this series called Dream Big. And we've been reading along with the book Dream Big by Bob Goff. Hopefully you've had a chance to read and be tracking along with it. If you haven't, great read. There's some really good stuff in there that I think is just a huge encouragement to anybody, no matter where they are in their journey. And so the first week when we started, Josh asked a question as he kind of posed and set up this series. He said, what we want to do is really establish, well, what do we really want from our lives? What does it mean to be living our best life now? Or even said a little bit differently, how do we seek out and carry out God's absolute best for us? And that's been the focus of this series as we look at how do we dream big? How do we fulfill our dreams? How do we live in the place where we can be in God's best plan for us? And this week we have a super exciting topic that I think you all find super enthralling and uplifting. We're going to talk about setbacks and failure. Who's excited? Like, we love to talk about our failures, right? I thought as I was working through this, I thought, well, this is pretty open and shut. This will be a short service because 2020. Let's pray. Right? This has been a year filled with a lot of setbacks. And we've experienced personal setbacks, local setbacks, regional setbacks, national, worldwide. I couldn't possibly begin to list how this year has been has had setbacks and failures and struggles and storms in each and every one of our lives. I don't know if you maybe seen, there's a popular video on social media that people keep remaking. This is not a theological statement, so please do not judge the message on this. But there's this this video of God talking with an angel. And he goes to the angel and he says, hey, how are you doing with getting all the stuff set up for the 2020s? And the angel's like, oh, it's good. Wait, did you say the 2020s? Like plural? God said, yeah, like all the events for the 2020s. He's like, oh, plural. And so God is like, wait. Did you put the events of 10 years into one? And it's just this realization that that's what this year has felt like, hasn't it? It's felt like the worldwide events of 10 years has just been compacted, and we still aren't even at the end of 2020 yet. And so it's been a tough year. It's been a year of setbacks and kind of realizing this, that reality. And so as we look and bring it back into this dream big and the idea of fulfilling God's best for us, it's important to remember that part of the road to discovery of the dreams God has for our lives, so not just our dreams, but the dreams that God has for us, unfortunately involves setbacks. That's a hard part of it. It's hard to recognize that failure is a part of the process. Many of you have heard the cliche statements, we learn from our mistakes, or my personal favorite, fail forward, right? Those are, when you're in the midst of the storm and you hear those statements, it can usually, for me at least, invoke some sort of an eye roll. Like, oh, man, really? But there's a lot of truth to those statements, and they don't need to be cliche, and that's kind of what we're going to explore today. So let me tell you a little story. Some of you know this about me, that about a little over a year ago, I started to kind of play out something that has been a dream in my life since I was a teenager, and I've been working on getting my private pilot's license. There's a picture up there, I think. Yeah, there we go. So yes, I am flying and taking a picture of myself. I sent the picture to my kids, and they were like, "Are you texting and flying?" Yes, I am texting and flying. It is apparently not illegal. I checked. So I've been working on my private pilot's license, and it's been a journey with a lot of potential for some failure, some pretty catastrophic failure if I'm not too careful. But this journey of a little over a year of working on my private pilot's license it's come with a few setbacks. Fortunately, none that involved, slamming into the ground. But back in February, my last lesson that I had in February of this year was my last lesson before getting my solo. And part of the private pilot's license process is you go through this training, you're working with an instructor, and eventually they give you the keys to the plane before you have your license, and they let you go up and fly by yourself. They don't let you take people in the plane when you're a solo because, you might kill yourself, but at least you're not going to kill other people. And so I was one lesson away from my solo. I was ready. My next one was going to be my solo check ride. I go out with an instructor, and he was going to sign off and give me my solo. And the world kind of shut down, including the flight school. And so for 4 months, I couldn't fly. And so I had to wait until June before I could start flying again. And I was all excited. I was eager. I thought, I can just pick it right back up. That's not something you just pick right back up, apparently. And so there's a lot of practice that's required in flying. And so 4 months, I lost a lot of growth. And I had to spend another 4 months just preparing for my solo. So it was a setback. It was a setback in my training. It felt defeating. It was a setback financially because I had to pay for 4 more months of lessons before I was ready to go and fly solo. And then, so finally though, 4 months after that, in September-ish, October, I was ready again. It was time for my solo flight. My uncle was also a private pilot when I was growing up, and he's probably the person that fed this dream of mine. He used to always talk about it, and I would talk about how excited I was and how much I wanted to become a pilot myself. And he used to always say, when I went out for my first solo, I just about peed myself. I think we can say peed in church, right? There have been worse things said on this stage, so. And he said that over and over and over again. And I thought it was just a catchphrase. Like, I was so terrified. Like people just say things to embody what they're feeling. And I got out there for my first solo, and the way that it works is you get in the plane and your instructor takes you up twice and you do 2 landings with your instructor. And then the instructor gets out of the plane. And one of the things that happens when that happens is 200 pounds gets out of the plane. If you know anything about flying, that changes a lot of things that I had never experienced before. So this was the first time I'm flying with a lot less weight in the plane and by myself, without the instructor's hands constantly on the controls. It's like driver's ed, they've got that brake that they can always touch. Well, he's got all the same controls on his side that I have on mine. He can take over at any time, which he did plenty of times in my training to prevent death. So now it was time for me to go by myself. And those words from my uncle kept ringing through my head like, I just about peed myself. So I took off, and I took off pretty easily because there was 200 less pounds on the plane, and kind of lifted right off the ground, and I thought, this feels good. I go up and I go around in a circle, and I come in for my first landing. And those words just keep repeating in my head. Like, I think I understand what he's talking about. And I come in for the landing, and everything is different. It feels completely different because there's 200 less pounds in the plane. So everything, I'm doing this for the first time by myself, but it's a new experience because it feels completely different. And I'm standing here to talk about it, so that tells you a little bit about how it ended. But I did hit the runway with a great deal of force. So much so that I went careening across the runway, almost off into the grass, and bad things will happen when planes go off the runway into the grass. And it was pretty terrifying. And I just about peed myself. It was scary. And so I was able to muscle myself back into the center of the runway and bring the plane to a complete stop. And he had said, you have to stop completely on the runway. I understood why now, because it was to regain composure. So I got myself back in the center and stopped. I still have to do it 2 more times in order to pass the solo. And I'll tell you, in that moment, that was a setback. I was scared. It was a lot of fear and terror after that experience because I felt like I just about died. And I could have. And so I had a moment to decide. And there were thoughts, like in that moment, you know how in a moment you can fit about 4 hours worth of thoughts? And they go by pretty quickly. And there were lots of like, okay, I'm done. This was good while it lasted, but I'm all set, I can't do this anymore. And I almost made that decision, and I realized, I thought, okay, if I'm gonna do this is, the moment is right now. If I keep second guessing myself, I'll never get back in an airplane again. And so I punched it and took off again, and I was like, all right, Jesus, Jesus, take the wheel. Gives a whole new meaning to that song. I was singing it the whole way around. And so I took back off the second time and went around for the second landing and came back in and didn't have as horrible of an experience as I did the first time. Wasn't super awesome, but it was definitely cleaner and didn't get as close to death as I had the first time. And so I took off again, and I had to do it one last time. And I came back in for that last landing, and it was textbook. It was perfect. Like, it was exactly the way that it was supposed to be. It felt really good to come back in and not die. And I got my solo. And all along, I didn't realize that my instructor, I dropped him off at the airport, that he jumped into a golf cart and rode to the end of the runway, so he was watching me. I was like, the end of the runway, probably not a good place to be after my first experience. But so he was able to watch the whole experience and critique me, and when I realized he was there, I was like, oh, that's gonna sting when he talks about the first one. And he was just super encouraging about it, because apparently that's everybody's experience, like my uncle. They just about peed themselves when they get on their first solo. And apparently that's part of the process, is like, you're supposed to be really scared of this. Like, fear, this is a healthy fear. There's unhealthy fears, and we're gonna talk about those for the most part. But being a little afraid that you're going to plummet into the ground is apparently a healthy fear when you're going to be a pilot. But it was a setback. It was a moment in which I thought, I'm going to give up on this. And it was really tough. So where do we experience setbacks in our lives? So relationships. Some of you have experienced setbacks in the relationships. In your job. Maybe there's been a setback in your job. You didn't get a position that you were hoping for. You lost a job. All kinds of different things. There's lots of job setbacks happening in our culture today. Financials. Maybe some of you have experienced financial setbacks. This period in our world has been very difficult financially for many. And maybe you've experienced a financial setback. Maybe you've been in recovery. And setbacks is a big part of recovery. In fact, it's a big part of moving forward in recovery, is what we learn when we go through recovery from substances or whatever, that you understand that failure becomes part of the process. But it's hard. It's one of the hardest parts of the process. We experience setbacks by the nature of the fact that we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And that makes it difficult. And unfortunately, our culture has trained us to fear failure. It's taught us to believe that failure is fatal. That's what we've become in tune to, not just in this current day and age, but in our culture in general. We've been tuned to fear failures, to fear our setbacks. And what has happened is we hide from our failures, and we hide our failures from others, and we hide from them ourselves. I love what Tyler said as he was introducing one of the songs this morning, that we have this tendency to put out on social media or out in the world our best foot forward, our best side. We come to church and we put our best side forward because that's what we want people to see. We don't want people to see the bad stuff. Now, I'm not encouraging you here to go and live out all of the horrible parts of your life on social media. You don't need to be that kind of person. But it speaks to what our culture has become. That's a consequence of the fact that we hide our failures instead of learning from them and failing forward. But see, when we hide our failures from others and we hide from those failures ourselves, we create a place where we cannot be in our best life now. We create a place where we can't sift through and find God's absolute best for each and every one of us. He has a best plan for each of us. And when we hide from our failures, we create an environment where we can't find that. And see, this morning I want to talk about a character from the Bible who proposes something that is the opposite of that. His name is Peter. He's one of the disciples. And what we learned from Peter is that failure is not fatal. And Peter learned a lot about failure in his life and had some pretty substantial setbacks that teach us that failure doesn't need to be fatal. And let me tell you, before we get into this, a little bit about Peter. Peter was a pretty big personality. He was kind of the center of attention. Everybody kind of knew Peter was in the room when he was there. He was also one of Jesus' closest friends and confidants. But Peter had a few setbacks that some could have thought could have been fatal for him. And the first we're going to take a look at is in the book of Matthew. So if you have your Bible, I want to encourage you to open it up to Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. If you don't have your Bible, we'll have the verses up on the screen. And many of you have heard this story before, but I think it's really relevant as we talk about our dreams and how setbacks help us to attain those dreams and find our best life now. So it says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. While he sent the people home, after sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. I want you to remember those two words, at once. I'm going to test you on it in a few minutes. Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage, I am here. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified, and he began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. Another important word. He immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. So then as we start to get into this idea of setbacks, it's important to recognize God's place in our setbacks. And there's a couple of really important phrases in this verse that I think are good reminders to us of where God is and exists in our lives. And so as Peter began to sink, it said Jesus immediately reached out. And then what were the other two words? At once. A few of you are paying attention. That's good. At once. Jesus spoke to them at once. They were in fear. They were fearing, and Jesus responded immediately. He didn't wait. He didn't say, I'm going to let them live in their fear a little bit. He didn't Peter could probably hold his breath for a minute and a half, so. No, he immediately reached down. He spoke immediately to them in their fear. Because I believe that Jesus' heart for us really is to not live in that fear and to be afraid. And he says in that, don't be afraid, take courage, I am here. That just speaks volumes of the heart of where Jesus approaches us when he approaches us in our setbacks and our failures. You see, fear is one of the 4 core emotions that we were designed with this. So fear is okay. It is a natural part of who we are. It is natural for me to fear the ground as I plummet towards it in an airplane. That's a healthy fear. There's joy, sadness, anger, and fear. They are all core emotions. However, a lot of our setbacks and our failures are rooted in fear. Peter and his disciples were afraid of the storm. Like Peter, we often call out to Jesus in our fear. It's a good first step. We've all been in that place where we've called out to God in our fear. It's the first step. And usually, Jesus responds with, don't be afraid, take courage, I am here. We may not hear those words, but they exist. And God says them to us over and over and over again. And like Peter, oftentimes in life, we step out of the boat despite our fear and our anxiety and the risk that we feel like we're going to take. We step out of that boat and we take a step or two. But fear sweeps in again, and then we begin to sink. So just to give some context to this story of what's happening with Peter, this isn't like number one pond, okay? It says they crossed the lake, but it really isn't the lake, it's the Sea of Galilee, okay? So this is like perfect storm kind of thing. These waves are pretty substantial. They are in the middle of a stormy ocean, far, far from land. And out of nowhere comes Jesus walking on the water. There was a real reason for them to be afraid. It was a natural response. And so, but they recognized Jesus was present. So they took that step, and he started to walk towards Jesus. And this is where we often get tripped up, is we get into the storm a little bit further. We've got this a little bit of confidence. We're like, I trust God, I'm going to take this step, and I'm going to move forward into this. And then our senses kick in, and they take over. And we freak out and we panic because fear feels like it's going to be fatal. The key word there is it's a feeling. Feels like it's going to be fatal. We let our senses undermine the potential for Jesus to use miracles to help us through a storm. Peter's senses in that moment said, something's wrong. This isn't right. Even though he could see Jesus, and he knew he was there enough, he knew Jesus was there enough to step out of a boat in the middle of the ocean. Who does that? Like that already speaks to the level of confidence that Peter had to know that Jesus was there. But once he got further into the storm and the boat was further away, his senses kicked in and the feelings said something different. This doesn't feel right. And they took over. And so feelings are important. I do not want to diminish the value and importance in our feelings. But feelings can lie. Feelings are a defense mechanism. So the nature and the reason why those feelings do that and why they lie to us is because they're trying to protect us. But they can lie to us. And so that's really important to remember as we think about the setbacks that we find ourselves in. So let's fast forward a little bit. Staying in the book of Matthew to chapter 26. Peter has another setback that could have proved to be pretty fatal for him in a different way. You see, after the Last Supper, Jesus and the disciples were on their way to the Mount of Olives. And in Matthew 26:34 is where we're going to pick this up. And it says, Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, Peter, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. In verse 35, that has to have been a blow to him. Like, that has to have been some hard words to hear. Verse 35, it says, no, Peter insisted, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. I believe Peter meant those words. I don't think he was lying in that moment. I believe he believed it with everything within him, that he would never deny Jesus, that he would be willing to die with him. How many times have we said that, things like that to God? God, I'll never do that again. I said it for a quick moment on the runway. I'll never do that again. But like even in life circumstances, right? I'll never pick up a drink again. I'll never date someone like that again. We say that to God, I'll never do that again. We say it a lot in our lives. Oftentimes it's unfortunately followed usually with the words, if you'll just. I'll never do that again, God, if you just fill in the blank. That's a sermon for another time. But we mean it when we say those words. I really believe, take the recovery example there. I believe that people who struggle with addiction to substances, and they say, I'll never pick up a drink again, I believe they really do mean it. It's not lip service. Failure is hard. It stinks. But it is part of the process. And if you've been through recovery, you know that. You know that failure is part of the process. It doesn't dismiss and make failure okay, but you have to acknowledge that failure and setbacks are a part of the process. So, Peter has said, no way, Jose. Jesus, I'm not going to. I'm sure that's exactly what he said. No way, Jose. It's in the Bible. I'm not going to deny you. There's no way. I will even die for you. So we fast forward, though, to chapter 26, verse 69 in Matthew. Not that far away from the moment he said that. It says, meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came over and said to him, you were one of those with Jesus the Galilean. But Peter denied it in front of everyone. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Later, out by the gate, another servant girl noticed him and said to those standing around, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath. I don't even know that man, he said. A little later, some of the other bystanders came over to Peter and said, you must be one of them. We can tell by your Galilean accent. Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. And immediately, the rooster crowed. Every time I read that verse, I get goosebumps because like, oh, man. Again, it took him to hear the rooster crowing. It wasn't that long ago that he said the words to Jesus, I'll never deny you. I will die for you. And he's now done it 3 times exactly as Jesus had predicted. And suddenly, Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And it says, and he went away weeping bitterly. I can't imagine what that must have felt like. He knew the depth of the words that he had promised to Jesus, that he would never deny him, and then it happened exactly the way he said. Have you ever been in a situation where you were told you're probably going to mess up, denied it to the end and said, no way, I'm not going to do it, and then did it? Right? If you've ever been under the age of 18, you should know what I'm talking about. Parents, how many of you, like me, swore, when I have kids, I'll never do that or say that to my kids? It's almost like every single thing I ever said about that to my parents, I did and said. My mother was always the first person to say, yeah, you'll see. Wait till you have kids. And I was like, no. And I believed it in my heart. I believed I will not do that. I thought like my mom was crazy. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to be a perfect parent. My kids will tell you. Didn't happen. But Peter knew the moment that the rooster crowed. He knew. He wept bitterly. He knew what he had done. This should have been a career ender for him. This should have been a career ender. Look where it got Judas. It didn't end well for him. He denied Jesus. That has to have stung. Remember, I said at the very beginning, he was one of Jesus' closest confidants. He was a really close friend of Jesus. But if you know the story, did Peter's failure exclude him from Jesus' plan for him? It didn't. The exact opposite happened. Peter had some pretty colossal failure. He almost lost his life by stepping out of the boat. He did some pretty, to deny Jesus after promising he would never. That was pretty substantial. That was a setback. It was a real personal setback for him. It was hard. But that didn't exclude him from Jesus' plan for him, for God's plan for him. You see, Peter ended up, he was one of the first of the 12 disciples that Jesus appeared to after he came back. Peter actually goes on to lead all of the disciples. He becomes the leader of the disciples. Peter actually was the first person to preach a sermon where over 3,000 people came to know Jesus. Ultimately, Peter goes on to be the leader of what we call today the church. The church is meeting all over the world and has formed the church, the big C, where we gather together and we focus on and learn from Jesus and how he can impact and change our lives. And that church was built on Peter after he denied Jesus 3 times. So the point this morning is that failure does not disqualify you. Failure does not disqualify you. The only way that failure or setbacks can get the last word is if we choose to let it. If we choose to let our failures get the best of us, then they will. They will have the last word. We do have a choice. Many of you know that I'm coming up on 3 years since I had a stroke 3 years ago. That was definitely not on the agenda. That was not in the plan. And it really knocked me off my feet. It was a setback. It was a setback I couldn't even possibly begin to have prepared for. And it was hard. It was hard physically. It was hard emotionally. It was hard spiritually. It hit me at all aspects of my life. And there were many times in that setback where I had choices. It was the first time I ever dealt with anxiety and depression. And there were moments while I never wanted to take my own life, there were moments where I thought, God, why didn't you take me when the stroke happened? Why do I have to deal with what I'm in? Why do I have to face the storm that I'm standing in? And it was hard. My speech was very, very affected. That's really difficult in my line of work, is not being able to speak. It affected my memory. It affected a lot of things. And it was really hard. The 6 months after my stroke was a pretty significant storm. And I came through that not because of anything that I did, because I wanted to give up. I wanted to give up a lot in those 6 months. But I came through that, and I get to stand here today and be able to speak because of the amazing things that God chose to do in my life, because of the plan that God had for me despite my setbacks. Those setbacks didn't disqualify me. There are a lot of times that I feel unqualified because of them. But God is so amazing and powerful that he takes our defeats and our missteps, our setbacks, to still use us to bring glory to his name. God uses our mess. What's the phrase? God uses our mess and turns it into a message, right? All kinds of fun cliches we can come up with around this one. But there's so much truth to that. God takes our setbacks and uses them if we choose to. So how do we choose to? It's like easier said than done, right? So there's some things that I think we can do that set the pace. It doesn't mean it's going to make it easier. So please, disclaimer here. Setbacks stink. It's hard. This isn't going to make the setback, easy peasy. It's still going to be difficult. But it does set the pace for us to come out on the other side, hopefully finding our best life now. Hopefully discovering a little bit of more about what God has for us. His best for each and every one of us. And so the first step, just like Peter did in the boat, is to reach out to God and acknowledge that he is present in our storms. Reach out to God and acknowledge that he's present in our storms. That's what Peter did. We just have to know that we are not in this alone, that God walks with us through the storm. The second thing that we can do is come up with a game plan. If you've been reading and tracking along in the book, you've read a little bit about what Bob Goff's suggestions are for coming up with a great game plan for failure. And I love some of these. I want to share them with you. One of the things he talks about is the 3 tickets that he puts in his pocket. He talks about how he puts 3 red tickets in his pocket, carries them around all the time as a reminder that each year he's going to mess up colossally 3 times probably. The catastrophic failure. He's going to face some pretty significant setbacks. And those tickets remind him of that. And that could be read different ways. Like, I don't want to focus on the negative. And that's not what the intention is there. But it's to be prepared and acknowledge that failures are going to happen, and we don't need to hide from them. The second suggestion he makes is to write a letter labeled "Open in Case of Setback." What a great opportunity for you when you're not in the midst of setback to write a letter to yourself, to encourage yourself, and remind yourself of what we're talking about this morning. That Peter set a great example for us of how we can deal with our setbacks. You're not going to want to write that letter in the midst of the setback. So write it when you're not there and put it in an envelope where you see it, open in case of a setback. The next thing you can do is to cultivate things in your life that are taller and truer than the failure. If you think back for a moment with me about where you've been in the midst of the storm, where your setbacks have been, it feels like the situation Peter found himself in the Sea of Galilee, that you can be drowning and sinking, and these waves are just tossing you everywhere. That's what setback feels like. That's a great word picture to describe it. But one of the things that we can do is to cultivate things in our life that are taller and truer than our failure, something to set our sights above the water. And it's those things that God will use to keep us from sinking. He also suggests don't sulk and get sucked into the eddy of self-pity. Oh, woe is me. We play that game, right? Nobody knows, nobody understands. He also suggests keep your head up, don't shade it, admit it. And there's a great quote at the end of the book. I'm going to print this and hang it up somewhere where I see it often. At the very end of this chapter, Bob Goff says, "You messed up. Doing this doesn't mean you are a mess up. It means you are a dreamer who's willing to take some risks, get a few scrapes, clear away the ashes, and build some new foundations." So I'd invite you to grab your communication card. There's a couple of next steps I want to encourage you with going into this week that can help, I think, move us forward, taking the first few steps into what maybe we are struggling in setbacks right now. So the first one says, I will think through the most recent setback and identify how God was with me in that setback. It's in the midst of those setbacks and those failures that it's really difficult to see God. I was really angry at God after my stroke. Really angry. And so it was difficult for me to see that. But now, 3 years later, I can look back and see where he was. Made it through the first service without crying. I can see the moments that I wasn't doing anything. It was God that was carrying me through those moments in that setback. That's part of what helps us to prepare for the next setback. We don't learn from our mistakes if we don't go back and look at them and figure out what we did wrong and figure out where God was present with us in that moment. They're waste. Don't let your failures be a waste. The second thing I want to challenge you is I will share about a setback I have been hiding with someone else this week. And I want to amend that one, actually. Because when I thought about it, I realized that's a big step. That's a big step. Every person in this room has some failures and setbacks that you have shared with no one. That's a fact. So let me release that boulder right off of your shoulders immediately. Everybody sitting around you has setbacks that they have not shared with another person. I want you to think about that this week. Just start by writing it down. Share it with yourself. Get it out of here and onto a piece of paper where you can acknowledge that it happened. That's a huge first step. And maybe the next step is find somebody that you can share it with. Let me tell you the freedom that is found in sharing and not hiding our setbacks with somebody else. That's where God shows up, in the people that you walk alongside with through your difficult times. That's where you will look back. When I look back to after my stroke, I see people who walked alongside me, people in this room. 3, I will spend a few minutes this week working on my game plan for the next setback. Maybe you'll write your letter and put it in an envelope. Maybe you'll put 3 tickets or 3 coins in your pocket as a reminder that setbacks are going to be coming. If you're not feeling like you're in the midst of one now, another one will come down the road. And what you can do right now in your heart to prepare for that will make a big difference in how you navigate through that in the next step. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to just be here this morning and to to look at what we can learn from Peter. God, I thank you for walking alongside him through his setbacks so that we today have an example of how we can approach those experiences in our own lives. God, I pray that this morning that we walk out of this room with just a true understanding that you walk with us, that our failures don't disqualify us, that you have an amazing power to take our setbacks and turn them into something great. Father, that you took Peter from pretty significant setbacks and put him in a place where he led the church. That's pretty impressive, God. And so, God, let us focus this week on those things that you can do and not the things that we have control of or don't have control of in our own lives. God, put people in our lives that we can share our setbacks and our failures with that will love us no matter what. Put people in our lives that, God, you will show up in as we navigate the storms of life that we face. God, you know the stories of everybody sitting in the room today. You know the storms that people are sitting in right here and now, the storms that wait in the parking lot. God, I pray that you'd be with us as we step out into the boat, out of the boat and into the ocean. That we walk alongside you so that we don't sink. Father, be with us, strengthen us as we seek to be the men and the women that you designed us to be. I pray all these things in Jesus' name.